Hello, and welcome to Speaking of Supply Chain, where we explore trends, current events, and innovations impacting the logistics and supply chain industries. I am your host, Ellen Wood. One of the big conversations in our industry right now is finding talent. The labor market for capable supply chain and logistics professionals is so very thin that it often feels like companies are playing tug of war with most qualified candidates. And one of the big questions is what can we do to make sure that in these upcoming years, we have the talent pool that's ready to take on the challenges that the future is going to hold? And as it turns out, tug of war isn't a bad place to start. We need to shift our focus to the generation of individuals that are still out on the playgrounds. So joining me today is a very special guest, Stephanie Castillo, and she is a science communicator. She creates career content for the younger generation, for elementary and millennials. And she has her own podcast, The Genius Generation. Stephanie, welcome to Speaking of Supply Chain.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, you are a bit of an unusual guest for us because you do not have any supply chain background. Your background is all about education and STEM. So tell
Yeah,
us a little bit about that.
yeah. So I actually have my bachelor's and master's in chemistry, and then I was pursuing a PhD in chemistry until I learned about science communication as like a career option or career field, and mostly stemmed from seeing a lot of my peers who are also in a graduate program kind of talking about their research and trying to make it more accessible for the general public to read, because most of the stuff that we do when it comes to the research that we do within academia kind of stays behind the paywalls. It stays within our technical fields, and then we're confused as to why the general public doesn't understand the science that we're doing, when we're not even communicating it to them. And so with Instagram kind of on the rise with the videos platform and whatnot, I just started creating content on there, and then eventually to YouTube. And then I was able to pivot my career to pursue a PhD in science communication, where I learned and studied effective narratives on how young audiences perceive science and scientists in digital media.
That is so amazing. I can't wait to tie this into supply chain. Before we get into that, let's take just a minute, and I have an icebreaker question for you. So, what is the best piece of advice that you have ever been given?
I felt like it's a lesson I learned in hindsight, but then once a friend told me this quote, I was like, yes, this is kind of what I live by. But it's essentially the answer is always no if you don't ask.
Ah,
And
yes.
and so I think that it really applies a lot to kind of like my career journey. Like I'm presenting it right now very linearly,
Mhm.
but I actually failed out of my chemistry PhD
Oh,
program.
no.
Not in the sense that it just wasn't the right environment for me. I wasn't really invested in, and
Hmm.
I just didn't really get the appropriate training that I was wanting.
Hmm.
And I can say the department felt the same way. And so, but like once I was met with the decision to either like retry and, continue to persist within the chemistry PhD program I was in, or I can leave with my master's. I just wasn't happy with either of those options. And so, a couple of days after failing this big exam to become a PhD candidate, I talked to many of my mentors, and the last conversation ended me in the office of the dean of the graduate school. And I was able to learn that there was actually a plan C that I would have never known about if I wasn't in his office. And so that's how I was able to kind of pivot my career and make a PhD program that was tailored to exactly what I needed, and to come up with the own committee and my own source of funding to continue to pursue this career path, and really carved a niche for myself. And I wouldn't have found that out if I just was okay with what
Sure.
was presented in front of me.
With what
Um,
yeah, what happened with the results
Yeah.
of something else outside of your control. Well, no,
Yeah.
that's so interesting that that's your favorite piece of advice, because that came up in like the last couple days for me. Someone else mentioned this, like the almost verbatim the same thing. The answer is always
Hmm.
no if you don't ask.
Hmm.
And it's such a great piece of advice. So mine is kind of along the same lines. I always answer the icebreaker question as well. So it's
Hmm.
not just you.
Yeah.
But the best piece of advice that I've ever been given was also given to me by one of my mentors. He is a supervisor, a boss from a previous position, and he really helped me in my career path and what I wanted to do and how to get there from where I was standing. And his advice, it was, what you allow is what will continue. Like the behavior, the treatment that you allow other people to give you is what they're going to continue until you put your foot down and say, no, you're not going to treat me like that, or no, I'm not going to continue to do this because for whatever reason. And it could be good, it could be bad,
Yeah.
but you control what you're going to allow into your own space. And kind of um, tangent to that is, don't take advice from, or don't take criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from.
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
were those were two great ones that he told me. He was like, it's all about you. You know who you are, you know what you want to accomplish, and you can get yourself there. And yes, you need other people to help you, but you're in control, and don't
Hmm.
ever feel like you're out of control. And he was just a great mentor. If
No,
he's
that's
listening out there, Ben, thank you.
I think it's pivotal within our careers to always have a great mentor. And I think, yeah, like even from my career, it's just like the in the first program, yeah, the environment that I was in was not the best fit, and I didn't stand for that. But I really took having to find mentors outside of the environment to realize, like, oh no, like this is not for you, and it's okay to leave.
Yeah, exactly. It's okay
Hmm.
to walk away.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. So let's see if we can tie these two very different speakers together today in this podcast. So I'm coming from the supply chain aspect and logistics. And I
Hmm.
say that even though I am not a logistics person. I'm a marketing person in a logistics company or a
Hmm.
supply chain company. And
Hmm.
I love everything that I do, but I have learned so much about the logistics and supply chain industries. And that's, like it or not, that's where I am now. So
Hmm.
that is my expertise that I'm bringing to the table. And you have all of this knowledge and capability about how to bring education on these incredibly complex topics like science and engineering. I mean, ours is an engineering company. So
Hmm.
bringing those down to the younger learners and getting them interested and passionate about these things. So how approachable is this industry, or is this topic even for school aged kids? Because I know my if I've got repeat listeners out there in the audience right now, you guys know I have three kids. I've got a freshman in high school, I've got a middle schooler, and I've got a 3-year-old. So I've got the whole range of learners right now, and trying to get them interested in something is sometimes really hard. Getting them interested in anything I do is absolutely not happening, but that's because I'm their mom. I don't think it has anything to do with the
Yeah,
subject
exactly.
matter.
Just pure spite.
Exactly. Just no. So when it comes to, this particular industry, is it even on their radar?
Honestly, I can't, I don't have any children. I do work within, doing a lot of outreach within K through 12, but honestly, I don't know. I really
Okay.
don't. I don't know, and I don't think so either, because at least with some of the programs that we've been, targeting in terms of schools, like we're now starting to see that there's like schools that have like STEM paths, either
Hmm.
going from like middle school to high school, that there's like, almost like magnet schools that are
Yes.
specifically geared towards STEM related fields. But even within that, I think I don't even know if like supply or like logistics will be kind of on their radar. I feel like we always lean towards almost the pure quote unquote science in terms of the traditional chemistry, marine biology, engineering, mathematics, and less into, what is the real world applications that a lot of these STEM careers kind of play a role into without realizing that there's a bigger picture and how, STEM is applied in our day-to-day life.
That's a great point because my oldest went to a STEM magnet school, like you were talking about. And
Mm-hmm.
when the kids were interested in science, they were interested in biology, they were interested in chemistry. Those are big and flashy and fun and
Mm-hmm.
hands on, very tactile for young learners, which is huge. They had, of course, the Lego Robotics Club. And I feel like that's where it really can be the place where the rubber meets the road for these kids, is because engineering is essentially, when you break it all the way down, it's solving a problem, looking at a problem and figuring out a way to solve it and get around it, or do it better, do it faster, do it cheaper, do it easier, do it without people. But when it comes to the logistics and supply chain, it's so pervasive. It covers everything from, whether it's, a truck driver, or, the airline pilot that flies freight, or the ocean liner, or the person who is developing a warehouse, our engineers that sit here and design the way all of these machines are going to work together and talk to the IT system, how we get product, how we manage to forecast, and the math and the analytical skills and the computer skills of how are we going to forecast what business is going to be based on previous trends. I mean, all of that falls into STEM, and the supply chain touches each and every one of us daily. And we don't even know it because it's just so ingrained into our society and into our way of life that it's just there, but it's not talked about. It's invisible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Unless you're stuck behind a semi on the road and frustrated that you can't pass them, then you're not so excited about supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing, one reason why I started making videos in the first place that were kind of leaning towards like career exposure essentially, is just because I didn't really know there was like subsets of fields in chemistry. And so I was like a senior in chemistry learning about that, but I was already in college. And
Hmm.
even as I continue on with the PhD, I didn't even know that science communication was a field until I was already 2 years into my graduate degree. And so I feel like that's kind of the same thing. These career paths are so invisible. They're so ingrained into kind of like the labor and logistics of, how the US is ran. Um, that when we think about STEM, we only think about the flashy stuff like let's go to space, let's we see Elon Musk
Yeah.
launching a rocket. Like you can be that person. But at the same time, and I think we're not associating the engineering or the
Hmm.
the science that goes into the supply chain logistics or career paths, and knowing that like this computer science degree can not only set you up to maybe be a computer gamer or like a virtual reality person, but like, oh no, you can actually not like look at the analytics of the data to analyze, okay, how can we better make this efficient, so then we're actually bringing in the things that we need for to meet the needs that we have in our current country. And I think it's the lack of exposure is just kind of like the biggest thing.
Well, and one of the things that I was thinking about when I was listening to some of your podcasts that you've done with the Genius Generation. Now, this podcast was amazing. I loved so many of those episodes, and I've talked about it with one of my colleagues who her daughter loves it as well. But it's all about kids solving problems. I mean, these kids are amazing in some of the ideas and concepts that they came up with, the problems that they looked at and they wanted to solve. And I've got a few that I want to just highlight here because these are the supply chain ones. Like, you had supply chain entrepreneurs on your podcast and
I didn't
maybe
even
didn't
know
even
it.
look at it that way. I mean,
Yeah.
there was one, Peter, and he was worried about monarch butterflies and their declining population, which is a huge issue. Monarch butterflies are pollinators, they're important to our food chain. And so he developed a distribution apparatus for milkweed seeds in a major metropolitan area. And that's huge. That is supply chain, getting the thing to where it needs to be, distributing it, and generating a demand for your product. That's sales, that's operation planning, that's sourcing, that's all of those things. There was, oh gosh, Lino, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, with kinetic kicks, the shoes that generate
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I don't
energy.
yeah, yeah.
He was still working on that. He hadn't gotten it finished, but I thought, oh my goodness, this child's brain power is amazing. We need these individuals. We need these kids. Oh, Angela with the bacteria that eats plastic.
Yes. Mhm.
So great. There was Varun with machine learning, and
Mhm.
um,
Was
there
that for the
was,
plant identification ones and the
yes.
farms? Mhm.
And then Tavish with the food banks, the disparity between food
Mhm.
banks where product was in one place and demand was in another. That is 100% demand planning. That's what we do in supply chain, is make sure that we've got the product to meet the demand in the place where it needs to be. And I want all of your guests to come work for us. So and
Uh,
maybe when they're old enough, to actually get jobs, a few of them are now, but these are the things that we need to encourage, that we need to point out and to other kids, so that they also get excited about this. And I think honestly, it's really the onus is on the supply chain industry. It's our fault that we're not reaching out to these younger generations.
Yeah, and I think it's almost like, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but it's almost like, in therapy, you don't realize something is being done until you're given the vocabulary to like describe
Exactly.
it.
Yes.
I feel like if you did not frame it to what you were saying it to me, like just now, about like how these students were
We're
essentially
working in the
applying,
supply,
yeah,
they're supply chain engineers, a whole list
yeah,
of them.
we just label it as just kind of like a general engineer or just entrepreneur. But yeah, I think we're not giving them the vocabulary to really break it down, to really analyze their own self-reflect in their own processes, to realize like, oh no, like, yeah, I'm sourcing this, I'm looking at distribution, I'm looking at the logistics, I'm planning this out, and that all of that falls within the realm of supply chain. And that this, aside from it just being not what you have to do, but kind of like, it kind of comes without saying in a sense, or it feels like it's coming without saying because it's just part of like the infrastructure. But
It's
if you're
just what they
not
were trying to do.
exactly, but but you're like, oh no, like this is a legit career, and this is like what we can think about in terms of, not only are you looking at the bigger picture of like, spreading your milkweed seeds as like, the coolest engineering thing that you're doing, but it's like, oh no, like this supply chain is also something that is in a career in and of itself, and can be applicable and something to strive towards as a real day job that you can make money doing.
Exactly. So, Peter is a young child, a teenager. He's distributing milkweed seeds because he cares about butterflies. That was something that he was passionate about, which is amazing and wonderful, and, should be celebrated. But when it comes to, the COVID vaccines and distribution and making sure that it got to where it needed to be, that was a huge logistical problem a couple years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
continues to be an ongoing, I don't want to say a battle, because we've kind of gotten our hands around it, but even, the next thing that comes out, the next super flu that we're going to get, because there's one every few years that runs around the world, and we've got to, catch up to that. Or, distributing food to the food banks. How do we get food to impoverished areas? How do we make sure that everyone has access to clean water? These are social problems that are important around the world, and they need logistical solutions. They need these young minds. They need these young people to be passionate about it, and to take a look at what they've already done and see that there's more application for what they already know how to do, what they're already excited about. But we need
Yeah.
to get more kids excited.
Yeah, and I think even just that, and just again, like, I'm having my mind blown just kind of talking to you, because like I never really thought about, your industry essentially.
And I think that's the whole point. That's why I've got you here, because it doesn't occur to everyone that this relates to them, that they have an impact on this.
Yeah. So one thing that's coming up right now is So I work for an entrepreneur, another education studio startup, and kind of making educational content. And one way that we're thinking about, you mentioned earlier, how are you increasing more critical thinking skills rather than just kind of like memorizing? And one of the things that we're trying to approach into is like handling real life data that like is published in
Hmm.
science and kind of teaching them like data science in a sense
Oh,
through
yeah.
how to read a graph, how to interpret the graph, and like how are you able to then use that to understand the bigger biological
Hmm.
or science concept. But in some of the design process that we're incorporating into this curriculum, a lot of the ways that we're kind of setting up our framework or for the students to kind of like build off of is like there's a huge problem in the world and we want to solve it. Like what is this product that we want to do? But it almost sorry, I'm thinking out loud in terms of like, okay, you're saying that Peter is thinking about like, oh, he wants to save the monarch butterflies. It's the same thing that kind of scientists do when they're thinking of like a research problem. Like, okay, we
Hmm.
want to have cleaner water in this place. We look into like we're looking into like, oh my God, what would be the ideal thing? But for you to break it down to be like, okay, what are the logistics and actually making this feasible? Like
Hmm.
even bringing it down to that problem is what we're overseeing and what you're
Hmm.
trying to or what the supply chain industry needs to do in order to kind of like highlight it to realize that like no, this in and of itself is like the issue that can kind of still help us tackle the bigger problem of like having to clean water rather than just like thinking of let me just design this new thing. i don't know
Exactly.
I don't know if
No.
that made any sense.
I followed. I followed.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you, the from your perspective as an educator, as trying to get this information out to these kids, it's coming from a
Hmm.
different perspective. And
Hmm.
me as a logistics person also trying to reach these kids is coming from a different perspective. But what we're doing, the end result of what we're doing could be approachable to kids. Our
Hmm.
stuff isn't approachable to kids. Yours is, but you don't have those terms for the logistics application of it. And
Hmm.
so, like, again, the logistics industry needs to just do a better job of making what we do and the way we do it interesting for children.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things that I was thinking about, we have the I did another podcast earlier this year on some of the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act in Germany, and the EU is also working on a Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. The countries are still working on kind of aligning on what some of those terms are going to be. But the end result is they're trying to make sure that the ESG, the social and environmental governance
Hmm.
is in place to make sure that we're protecting our environment, that we're treating people with dignity and respect, and that we're making sure that companies are doing this, because a lot of times companies are made up of people, but they seem to be this huge uh, high level disassociated brand name and not the people that work there. Because
Hmm.
obviously when it comes to a lot of these companies, the people who do work there do care, but it's a machine when
Hmm.
companies get that big, and those companies have supply chains that generate a lot of waste, a lot of
Hmm.
environmental waste, and they have a
Hmm.
huge carbon footprint. So the entire point is to reduce their carbon footprint. So they're having to get creative. They're having to look at some of these things that your guests had looked at in terms of bacteria that eat plastic, or how do we reduce our emissions, or how do we do something cleaner and better. And these are the topics that your students and that your audience wants to solve. They
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
don't know that logistics and the supply chain is a place where they can go solve it and get paid to do it.
Exactly, exactly. And especially when, again, so there's this competition, not competition, yeah, I think it's a competition, but the Washington D.C., like the
Hmm.
government, is running a science fair.
Oh, yeah.
And
Hmm.
um and so some of the questions that they're having is like, okay, come up with like your best solution to some of like the world's pressing problems.
Hmm.
But again, we think of when we frame it to these young audiences, we're framing it as to like, okay, how can you come up with the next best invention or like
Hmm.
think outside the box to build these bigger pictures. But kind of like what you're saying is we're not doing a good job at highlighting the the systems or infrastructure that's already in place in order to meet the logistics of the logistics
The
are not.
practical application
Yeah,
that's available today for them to, move the needle on some of these issues that are very
exactly.
important to them.
Exactly. So instead of just being like, okay, I'm going to create this new water bottle, it's like, oh no, okay, if this company's already making this water bottle, how can we make it more efficient for them to have less waste whenever they're,
Hmm.
creating or developing or using the plastics or whatever? I think it's just the difference of mindset and the difference of framing, and also tying it with the numbers that of having a salary. I think it's going to be
That's
will be
true.
kind of like the way to go.
You have to compete with the YouTube superstars out there.
No, but for real, that's a hard. Like a lot of kids are wanting to be YouTubers and content creators because they can see how the 1% is going very lucrative. But again, I think that's not every kid's desire or dream, especially
No.
for these kids that are very self starters, that have the entrepreneur spirit to create these own inventions without any teachers telling them to do this, their parents telling them to do this, but just having it within their own desire to want to be a part of a solution. And I think that Gen Alpha and even kind of like the older Gen Z are very much more solution oriented.
And that's
Um,
fantastic. Now I need
mhm.
to get them into my industry because we're having a labor shortage.
Yeah, and I think and so I think so I think that's the hardest part is how do you reach this audience, so how do you reach this audience knowing that you guys already have you working for this engineering company that already
Hmm.
does logistics. How do you reach this audience? And I think that's kind of like the biggest, not question, but maybe strategy that a lot of these professional science communicators,
Hmm.
universities, other STEM organizations and programs that are trying to recruit more students into being into more STEM. That's always the biggest strategy and the biggest thing that we're striving towards. And so knowing that curriculum is kind of hard to dive
Yeah,
into and
it
to
really
also
is.
and to break, like what we always turn to media because it is the number one thing that like most kids are on for hours at a time. And so instead of being watching these Mr. Beasts that are like blowing things up for like millions of dollars or whatever, like okay, how do we create content that can either professionally, or how can we create content that what am I trying to say? How do we create content um uh,
That's engaging, that gets
but
their
it's
attention, but that
yes.
also like inspires, teaches.
So essentially, for my PhD, I studied science videos
Hmm.
because the whole goal with Phuture Doctors was to how do I make sure I'm creating content that my audience actually wants to see and is actually going to learn from, and it's actually going to be like more beneficial to them rather than just kind of like a passive educational edutainment kind of thing.
Hmm.
So like I grew up as a PBS kid, so
Yeah,
so you
same.
know, but now we're competing with kind of like the Mr. Beast or like the pranksters and whatnot. So the whole challenge is like, okay, how do we actually create content that's going to be beneficial for them, that they're learning from? And so, like, for instance, Mark Rober is also kind of like in the same category as Mr. Beast. I don't know if you're familiar with him. I think he's a mechanical engineer, but he used to work for NASA and he actually worked on the rover that went to Mars.
Hmm.
And so that was kind of like his leg up into creating content on YouTube. But a lot
Hmm.
of the stuff that he teaches is, or not teaches, but a lot of the content that he does is about kind of like how is he using the engineering process to come up with this cool thing, um, like making the world's smallest Nerf gun. And so it still has an entertainment and value on it because
Because
you want,
yes.
yeah, exactly. You want people to watch how are you going to make the world's smallest Nerf gun, but throughout it, he's still showing his design thinking process into
Hmm.
creating this. But I don't believe, um, this is my personal opinion, but I don't believe like Mark Rober's intention is to inspire like the for students to pursue an engineering degree directly, but
Yeah,
because
that
it's
might
we're
be
seeing
an
how
indirect.
Exactly, but because it's so cool, hopefully it gauges their interest into wanting to learn more. So it's
Hmm.
like, how do we do the equivalent then in terms of logistics, logistics and supply? But if it's not a entertaining way, then how do you produce resources
Hmm.
or videos that can be used as resources for them to gain an understanding of these are the types of careers that are out there. These are the types of money that you can make. Like, this is, your career path doesn't have to be linear to pursue college. Like, you can still do these other things to make it
Hmm.
into this industry. And giving a behind the scenes look, or something that can be short enough and informational enough to be incorporated into curriculum, that's putting less burden on the teacher to have to
Come up
uh,
with it.
yeah, because at the end of the
Entertain
day.
their class.
Exactly, exactly. So it's like, I think that was kind of my main mission with Phuture Doctors, is like, okay, how do I create career, like, videos that expose students to new careers, or to new role models that are in fields that they've never heard about, and how do I make sure that it's either coming up with additional resources, or that the video can be used as resource themselves, that makes it easier to be included into the classroom without further work for the teachers. And so I think that's
Absolutely.
what your industry has to also look into, is that hiring other professional science communicators to make videos for you. And then also, yeah, like, you're a part of marketing. Like, what can you do to kind of create content for a different audience that can bring more eyes and more exposure to the field, and actually learn that the logistics that you guys are doing is a really big tie, or a really big connector to the bigger picture questions that we're trying to solve within STEM, in it of a huge industry.
Exactly. And one other thing I wanted to circle back to earlier, you had said something about, some of these STEM curriculums are available at magnet schools. They're available for the most talented, or the highest level learners in their groups, and a lot of the other kids are kind of left out of these types of opportunities to get access to some of this content. And even with your little anecdote about your chemistry doctorate, and how it just didn't work out for you. That didn't feel like the right place once you got there. And I feel like there are a lot of kids that are not the top 10% of their class, that they feel like, okay, well then what's left for me? Because they're all the exciting ones. They're all the doctors and the scientists, and that's all the exciting careers. But I'm not that smart, or I'm not the top of the class. So what's left for me? And I don't want to downplay the other logistics and supply chain roles that are out there. But when we do think about some of those roles, people working in warehouses, people driving semi trucks, people loading and unloading docks at a port, all of those things are critical to the supply chain. And that's what's really run things into the ground when we've had supply chain delays that have made the news over the past couple years. When things shut down, is because we didn't have people. We need people. Not everything can be done by a robot. Not everything can be done by a computer program or an algorithm or a machine. And people are so vitally important to the supply chain, to getting that Amazon package delivered to you the next day. And that's not to say that those individuals who are in those roles are not intelligent. They are very intelligent. They have to be. They have to follow schedules. They have to be able to route around, accidents on the roads. They have to be able to understand, the cargo that they're carrying, and what types of outside weather might affect their cargo, if they've got something that's frozen and very temperature controlled. So there are a lot of ways that even the middle range of students, or even the lower range of students, can be brought into this fold and say, look, there are still careers in this very exciting, very important field that you are completely capable of achieving. And they're very interesting. If you're a truck driver, you get to see the world, you get to drive around. If you're a pilot, or working on an airplane, you get to travel even further. If you're on an ocean liner, you might get to see some great locales. there's a lot to be proud of in the logistics industry, and I don't want to exclude any kids that aren't that top few percent just because they don't have this fantastic groundbreaking idea for something new. You know, the everyday and ordinary is also critically important to a lot of people.
I feel like it's a loaded question because only in the sense that it's almost like, again, from my perspective, just like my individual, I'm like not speaking on behalf of anybody at this moment, but just from kind of seeing it from the outside is just within our own society is kind of how
Mhm.
we glamorize some careers versus not glamorize others, and also
Mhm.
kind of like the stereotypes and um out of like almost like classism in a way that kind of comes into play that kind of really murkies the water. And
Mhm.
so it's just like we push a lot of people to go into college, but I feel like what about, yeah, again, like the trade, like what about the trade schools and like the showing that
Mhm.
these careers that are not in these working for the NASAs or anything like that hold just the
Exactly.
same amount of weight as working for the NASAs, and then the NASAs, but working for NASA. Yeah, showing, again, kind of removing these negative stereotypes or kind of like the negative light that we kind of frame uh, the
More manual
yeah,
functions.
yeah, more manual labor compared to um, coming up with rocket science or whatever. I keep thinking poking at NASA just because. Um, but yeah, I think it's almost like, how do we change that narrative to make
Mhm.
it more appealing and less in this kind of like negative connotation of that like manual labor is less than like those kids that are wanting to pursue a PhD or something like that. That they hold the same amount of weight. And again, I think it always comes down to, like, I remember, I don't know if this is true or not, but I remember when learning that those crane workers that like do the ship containers,
Mhm.
that they make money. They make, some of them like make money.
Six figures. It's a lot of money.
Yeah, but again, but it comes with, it's a high risk job.
It
Again,
is
very
very.
intense kind of labor, but
Mhm.
you don't know about it. You don't know about it because you just see them doing manual labor, and we put that as a less than category in
Mhm.
society wise compared to the Elon Musk that's coming up with the new Tesla. So how do we also put the same amount of weight and the same amount of care for these jobs that have had a different negative story applied
Mhm.
to them for years at this point?
Exactly. You need to go to the local arcade and find the kid that's playing the claw game and getting all the good prizes.
No, but it's almost like so I don't know. I think have you heard of KiwiCo?
Yes.
Yeah,
I
so
and in
like
fact, I've gotten a lot of those boxes for my kids to, build the little robot and, do the little things, and they love them. But
yeah.
it's always like just a toy they can build themselves,
Yeah.
and then they're done with it. But then my middle child will go and he will take the concept from that box that he
Mhm.
get, and he would try and apply it to something else. So he'll start just building something out of sticks and string in the
Mhm.
backyard, and all of a
Mhm.
sudden I've got a trebuchet.
That's amazing, but it's also like, I know with, you know, I know some of the care that they put into like the pamphlet,
Hmm.
but most of that, aside from it just being the directions on how to build it, they always have like little asides where you're like, the main goal for them is to teach you how to build, but they're still learning some science concepts along the way.
Hmm.
So how do you use that kind of maybe framework in a sense for supply chain to be like, okay, this crane, if you use this QR code, can link you to this video that teaches you about like this
This
career,
career.
this
Hmm.
six-figure career where you can like, it's a this manual labor job, but it's a part of the supply chain or the
Hmm.
logistics to the bigger picture of solving this issue in order to make the US run smoothly without any hiccups. I feel like, what does that look like for you guys in order to kind of like, you know glamorize it in a sense, or I don't know, glamorize it, but at least like show that
No,
it has weight and it has value, and
you're
it's
right.
and it's in the same caliber as other careers.
There's definitely a PR opportunity in the supply chain industry to get this information into um, these different audiences, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a great foundation with all of the STEM resources that you and others are developing for these young learners, and that are encouraging them and inspiring them and making them into this next generation of inventors and citizens that are going to
Mhm.
help us move these needles, in the right direction for our planet, for our society, just in general. I can't wait to see what some of these young individuals are going to do. um, but if we want them in supply chain needs to do a better job of reaching out to them and meeting them in that space.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So they're you know, like as at least in university, like we see that like when you guys are doing recruiting, but again, like how do you make it easier for the teachers? How do you make it easier to yeah, you have to meet them to where they are, to the spaces that there are, and not be clueless as to like, well, why isn't no one seeing us if like no one's even heard of your company before?
Exactly. I know a lot of supply chain companies that do a lot of work in career fairs and colleges and at that level. But I feel like in order to really build the talent pool that we want to have in the next 10 years, we've got to go a little bit further into high schools and middle schools and bring some of the ideas that we have and the ideas that we're trying to solve for to that next generation. See what they have in mind. What, Mr. Beast might have an idea. I don't know.
For sure, for sure.
All right. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been such a fun conversation. It is a departure from what I normally talk about, but I feel it's so important, especially as we look to the future that is for our children. And I want my industry to have a future. It obviously will. Supply chain is never going to go away. We've got to get our goods and services to where they need to be. So the more I can help encourage that conversation to take place and start to build our capabilities in that regard, I think I'm going to do a better job for the marketing of supply chain, which is where my expertise truly is. This brings us to the end of our episode. I hope our listeners enjoyed the episode and our conversation as much as I did. Um, if any of our listeners out there have a suggestion for a topic or would like to be a guest on our show, please reach out to me at podcast@mebach.com. You can email me anytime. As always, thank you for listening to Speaking of Supply Chain. If you've enjoyed our show, please rate it on whatever podcast platform you prefer and be sure to tune in next time.